podcast you're about to listen to is from a book series on post-qualitative, new materialist and critical post-humanist research. I'm Karen Murris and chief editor of this new Routledge series. You can find it on the following website, www.postqualitativeresearch.com. This recording is from Edge Entanglements with Mental Health Allyship Research and Practice, a Postqualitative Cartography by Tim Barlott and Jenny Setchell.
This is the first of our set of podcasts about the book Edge Entanglements with Mental Health Allyship Research and Practice, a Postqualitative Cartography. You're about to listen in on a conversation between the authors of the book, which are me, Tim Barlott, and Jenny Setchell, along with our colleague and friend Paint Fremmerlid, who's a transgender artist and poet. Our discussion, or the entry point to our discussion, is methodologically guided by theory, namely the notion of transversality from the work of Félix Guattari as well as Gilles Deleuze, which refers to the praxis of cutting across rigid relational lines and the production of creative zones of tension. You'll be witness to an experimental encounter between the three of us, an unscripted conversation that uses a tarot deck that's been created by Paint as a creative stimulus for conversation. Now, you don't need to be familiar with tarot or have access to these cards. We're simply using these cards as a way to intentionally draw from non-dominant knowledges from the queer and mad community. And the perspectives of queer and mad scholars have been incorporated into our book. Our experimentation here is an example about how we, as researchers and practitioners, might create experimental, creative, and playful encounters in our work, something that's central to our book, in hopes that something unexpected might emerge. Before we get into our discussion, we want to acknowledge the lands that we're on. I'm joining from Turtle Island, what's now referred to as Canada, and the city of Edmonton, what is also known as Amiskwatsy Waskahikan. These are the lands of a diversity of First Peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota, Dene, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe, lands that are now known as part of Treaty 7 and the homeland of the Métis. As a settler, I recognize the many First Peoples, knowledge keepers, and elders who have lived on, cared for, and thrived on these lands for generations. Treaty, as described by Anishinaabe scholar Aaron Mills, is not a contract, but a relationship where we recognize our necessary interdependence.
And I'm coming from a country they call Australia. I live in Meanjin, which is currently frequently known as Brisbane, on Turrbal and Yagara country. I want to acknowledge ancestors and elders and their descendants on these lands who have had connection to country here for millennia that is unceded country and untreated country at this point, unfortunately. Acknowledging their contribution to knowledges and understandings, to the way in which we live at the moment and the way in which we understand health, things like madness as well. So just keeping that in mind as we go through this conversation today.
And just as a way of introductions, there's three of us on the podcast today. So my name's Tim Barlott. My pronouns are he, him. I am assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of Alberta, and I'm one of the co-authors of the book.
Hi, and I'm Jenny Setchell, they, them pronouns. I am working in research in the Indigenous health space at the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health here in Meanjin, and I'm also a honorary senior research fellow at the University of Queensland. I'm a co-author of the book.
And we're joined today by Paint, and I'm probably going to not do your last name well, Paint Fremmerlid. and I'm going to let Paint introduce themselves.
Yeah, so I'm Paint Fremmerlid. I use he and they pronouns. I'm a non-binary transgender artist and poet, living in Edmonton, and I am also a friend of Tim's from working on different research projects before this, and also I'm a previously psychiatrized person. I've been institutionalized, and I've dealt with the psychiatric system and such, and so I've been in there, and so it's kind of cool to be invited to participate in this conversation about this book.
Now, when Jenny and I were first talking about doing a podcast for the book, we were thinking, how could, something that was part of the book was around creative experimentation and trying and playing. And we wondered, how could we bring some of that into our conversation today? So in the work that Paint and I have been doing together, I got introduced to Paint's work as an artist and as a writer, and their creation of a tarot deck. So it's the Patella tarot deck, and I wonder if Paint, if you wanted to just give a short introduction to what the tarot deck is, and then afterwards we're going to use the tarot deck to guide the dialogue that we have around the book.
Yeah, so the Patella Tarot is a tarot deck that I designed around the beginning of the pandemic. I worked on it for about a year to do all of the art. And it was actually inspired by polyvagal trauma theory because I wanted to visually represent that. And then I realized it looked kind of like a tarot card, the drawing that I made. And so I just kept going with that. And I made a whole bunch of cards and I made a tarot deck. And it's all about hypermobility, my invisible disability as a person with hypermobility, and about my exploration and experience of gender as a non-binary transgender person.
And what I was really taken by when I started to use the deck, Paint, was how justice informed it is, how it centers both individual experiences of injustice and some of the systemic things that are bound up in systemic oppressions, and offers a way to think about and explore and seek liberating possibilities in constraining circumstances. So it's something that I've really appreciated about the deck.
Thank you.
So now we're going to give it a go. I'm just editing in some commentary here. We're about to have a discussion about chapter 2 of the book, which looks at mechanisms of control in the mental health sector and possibilities for generating something otherwise, such as the freely given relationships that are introduced in the book. But first, we're going to pull 3 cards from Paint's tarot deck as a creative stimulus. Bear with us as we clunkily and virtually select our cards. If you're not following the specific array of the cards, don't worry. The conversation that follows is what matters. So, Paint, can you guide? I'm the one who has a set of cards with me. We're doing this remotely with Jenny in Australia and Paint and I in Canada. Can you guide me through doing this initial reading?
Sure. So the way I have my deck set up is it has these placement cards. So we're just going to do the smallest placement set, which has 3 cards. So if you find those and just like lay them out in front of you, they're numbered and they all have like lines that kind of overlap. So it's visually compelling. And then after that, you can shuffle the deck and you can pull 3 cards and you can put them down and then we can talk about them.
Fantastic. Okay, so I've got the 3 cards laid out in front of me. and I'm shuffling the deck. Jenny, do you want to tell me what card for my first selection, if that's possible?
The fourth one along.
The fourth one from the top?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're all shuffled. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm just going to leave them face down till I have all 3, if that's okay.
Yep.
And I've got my second. And Paint, can you pick the third one?
Oh, sure. Let me just adjust my screen. Let's see. Right by your middle finger. Right by your middle finger. That one. Yeah.
That one that
right
we
there.
can see?
Yeah. Just pull one out right there, right in the middle.
Got one there.
Yeah.
All right. So in the placement of card 1, and card 1 is reads honesty. So I'm just talking about the placement cards. So card 1 is honesty. And the card pulled was Adult of Leaves. Do you want me to read all of the ones I pulled first?
Yeah. Good. I'm just yeah. I would like to hear what they all are.
Okay, so I've got Adult of Leaves in placement number 1. Placement number 2 is for bravery, and that card is Teen of Leaves. And the final card in the placement for the placement card of Ideals is 6 of Candles.
Interesting. Cool. So right away, the second one, the Teen of Leaves, that one's my big boundaries card. Like that one to me is really, I don't know, it speaks about boundaries. So I just think that one is interesting to come up and talking about relationships.
Hmm. And then
I think
other cards.
Relationship.
Yeah.
Oh, do we want to? That's already making me think of things in relationship to the chapter, really, because boundaries can be really helpful and protective, I guess, in good ways, but also can be really constraining and restrictive. So I think the chapter does enter into some discussions about that and how in these sort of dominant major forces, when they get entangled in the mental health sector, that or when they're produced by the mental health sector, can create boundaries that are restrictive, particularly. So, and that can constrain relationships, I guess, to bring in your point there, Kate, Paint, about yeah.
And it also makes me think, because the book within the series on post-qualitative research, that there's an interest in unsettling some of the rigid boundaries that we have in research as well. That the distinct boundaries between who can be participants, or who are participants, who are the researchers, and the relationships between researcher and participant, the relationship between theory and experience as being kind of being binary, being separate. And I think part of what we do in the book is play a little bit at that boundary. We play a little bit at the threshold between theory and experience, and try to experiment in a way that doesn't violate boundaries, but maybe looks for some flexibility between things.
Yeah, I think that's cool that it came up in the second position, because it's about bravery, right? So it takes bravery to redefine boundaries and hold them maybe in a different kind of sacred way, or just carry them differently, right? It takes it takes courage to step outside that norm.
Mm.
The last card that you pulled, the Six of Candles for the ideals. In that card, I have two people who are inside of a knee joint who are being lifted up by a community of people supporting the knee joint. And to me, it really represents that sense of community unity. So I think that there is that, it's sort of speaking to that goal.
Hmm. And I mean, that's really interesting for me, given the focus of the book being on what can freely relationships between people do. What can communities of support do? And one of the things, I mean, many of the things that came up, but one of those is the ways that those communities of support can help to unsettle the rigid nature of the ways that people have been labeled and categorized and constrained within the mental health system. So even like thinking about boundaries in that second card, that some of the boundaries or the territories that have been constructed for people who've been psychiatrized are quite rigid. We talk about how the ways that those are constraining, and in this chapter we talk about some of the ways that the dominant mental health apparatus can be highly constraining, but in instances of community support and relationships that exist in the community, that some of that rigidity can get softened and can get loosened, and that the grips of the mental health system can get frayed through networks of community support. So that's really interesting for me to come up on that spot number 3.
Yeah, and I think that the chapter speaks to sort of disrupting binaries as a way of sort of transforming processes from sort of dominant to bringing in that more minoritarian or minor kind of element. So in terms of like boundaries existing or not existing, that's a binary, right? So I like how, Tim, you were using that word soften there. It's not necessarily about getting rid of all boundaries, but it's about having them as more porous or more shifting or softer. So it's really, really lovely. Also, I'm just looking at a quote from the chapter as well. So it's about disrupting boundaries, about decentering axes of power to produce these more minoritarian. So in this case, led by people who are psychiatrized, I guess, is one way of looking at that. So disrupting that power of who's leading these systems around mental health. And the third element was pursuing non-linear process. So it's not a structured path where we are channeled down to make these changes. So that it's got more flexibility, I guess, in that way. So
Paint, I'm really curious about card number 1, Adult of Leaves.
Yeah, so in that card, there's like a little baby who's kind of on the back of this other figure who is painting and also using a computer, and there's also a flower growing out of their back, sheltering the child who's resting there. And so for me, this is really about nurturing and providing, right? Because the card kind of represents like you're working hard to provide shelter. You're working hard to create like care and a container in order to be able to nurture others.
Making me think of another chapter, actually, and I'm wondering if we could move the conversation onto another chapter, which is where we focus more on that care aspect. Which chapter is that, Tim?
That would be chapter 8. When we talk about both careful and carelessness. Is that where you're thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That nurturing aspect, I guess, of these relationships. Yeah, look, we are experimenting here, just to let listeners know that this is unscripted, as you can imagine, probably by listening. So how about we focus on another chapter and see perhaps what this same reading, because I think it's so rich, can bring to that. Would that be appropriate, Paint?
I think so. I think that this can it applies really well to the themes of your book regardless, right? So I think that's a great idea.
The podcast that follows turns to a discussion about chapter 8 of the book, which is about becoming and transformative lines of careful and carelessness in relationships. We didn't plan to discuss this chapter, but that's where we landed.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to know more about this chapter, please visit the website www.postqualitativeresearch.com, and please stay tuned for future podcasts.